Somewhere in a grocery store right now, someone is reaching for oat milk. Maybe because they like the taste, maybe because they're lactose intolerant, maybe because of something they read about the dairy industry, or because a barista once told them it froths better. Every one of those is a perfectly good reason. But on the way to that oat milk, they walked straight past regular milk, a liquid produced by a completely different mammal species, specifically to feed that species' own infants, sitting in a carton, available for purchase by humans who were never calves and never will be. And that raises a question almost nobody standing in that aisle has ever actually asked. Why do we drink cow milk and not, say, horse milk, elephant milk, dog milk, or whale milk, which apparently has roughly the consistency of toothpaste and is so fat-dense that a whale calf can double its birth weight in a matter of weeks? A fact nobody requested and nobody's forgetting anytime soon. The obvious answer: cows are simply available, horses aren't typically kept for dairy, and nobody's out there milking a whale, is technically correct in the moment. But the deeper version of this question is far older and more interesting than a modern grocery aisle suggests. It touches evolutionary biology, ancient human history, and the specific accident of which large mammals happen to be easy to domesticate. And by the end of it, you'll understand something genuinely strange. For most of human history, drinking milk as an adult would have made you sick. Start with the biological baseline, because the default state for adult mammals, including us, is not being able to digest milk. Lactase is the enzyme responsible for breaking down lactose, the primary sugar in mammalian milk. Without it, lactose passes undigested into the large intestine, where gut bacteria ferment it, producing the gas, bloating, and cramping that define lactose intolerance. Every mammal produces lactase as an infant. It's essential for digesting mother's milk, the only food source during nursing. But in nearly every mammalian species, including most humans for most of our evolutionary history, lactase production shuts down dramatically after weaning. This shutdown, called lactase non-persistence, is the ancestral condition for mammals generally. The logic is simple. Once weaning ends, milk leaves the diet, so continuing to produce an enzyme with no use left is just wasted metabolic investment. And evolution doesn't keep paying for things that don't pay off. The mutation that changes this, lactase persistence, letting adults keep digesting milk, appears to have arisen in specific human populations somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, independently in parts of Europe and East Africa. In evolutionary terms, that's shockingly recent. Modern humans have existed as a species for roughly 300,000 years. Lactase persistence shows up in just the last 3 to 10% of that timeline. And the timing isn't a coincidence. It lines up almost exactly with the rise of dairy pastoralism, the practice of keeping cattle, sheep, and goats specifically for ongoing milk production. The mutation spread because it unlocked a brand new, calorie-dense food source for the people who happened to carry it, while everyone without it was left digestively locked out. Lactase persistence still isn't a universal human trait today. Its global distribution mirrors exactly where dairy pastoralism traditions existed historically. Across most of East and Southeast Asia, most of sub-Saharan Africa outside specific pastoral communities, indigenous American populations, and Pacific Islander populations, lactose intolerance in adults remains the biological norm, not the exception. So why cow milk specifically, rather than any other animals? The answer really comes down to two things: which animals actually produce milk in quantities worth harvesting, and which of those animals could realistically be domesticated. Milk yield varies enormously by species. A modern dairy cow can produce 30 to 40 liters a day. A horse manages 10 to 15. A sheep, well under a liter. A dog produces just enough for her own puppies and essentially nothing more. A whale produces exactly what a whale calf needs and nothing remotely usable by any human milking operation, even setting aside every other obvious practical problem involved. Beyond volume, composition matters too, and it varies wildly by species in ways that affect both digestibility and what products can even be made from the milk. Human milk runs about 3.8% fat and 7% lactose. Cow milk is close, at roughly 3.7% fat and 4.7% lactose, the nearest compositional match among commonly consumed animal milks. Horse milk is low in fat, around 1.5%, but higher in lactose, around 6%, which is exactly why the traditional step dairy product made from horse milk is fermented kumis rather than cheese. Cheese making needs fat that horse milk simply doesn't have. Sheep milk runs the opposite direction, roughly 7% fat, which is why many classic Mediterranean cheeses are built on sheep milk rather than cows. These aren't just flavor quirks. They directly shaped which dairy traditions were even possible in which regions, based on what animal milk was locally available and how human digestion could handle it. Then there's domestication, which is where this story connects most directly to deep human history. Of every large milk-producing mammal on Earth, only a small handful were ever suited to the kind of sustained human management that makes systematic milk collection possible. Tolerance for living near people, reliable reproduction under human care, and a temperament calm enough to allow actual milking. Cattle were domesticated roughly 10,000 years ago in the Near East from wild aurochs, animals that stood about 180 centimeters at the shoulder and weighed around a metric ton, aggressive and genuinely formidable. Turning that into a docile dairy animal took generations of deliberate selection for reduced size and reduced aggression. Goats and sheep were domesticated in the same region around the same period, forming some of the oldest dairy traditions on record. Goat milk in particular is lower in a specific casein protein than cow milk, making it easier to digest for some lactose-intolerant people, which shaped the specific dairy products built around it. Horses were domesticated roughly 5,500 years ago on the Eurasian steppe, initially for riding, meat, and labor, with dairy use developing later, giving rise to the fermented mare's milk tradition of kumis, distinct from the cattle-based dairy traditions developing at the same time further south and west. Yaks were domesticated on the Tibetan Plateau for high-altitude pastoral life, Bactrian camels across Central Asian deserts, water buffalo in South and Southeast Asian wetland farming. Each one its own specific human-animal-dairy relationship shaped by a specific ecology and a specific cultural tradition. Now for the animals that were right there, available, and still never became dairy animals, because the reasons are, frankly, hilarious once you hear them. Elephants have worked alongside humans across South and Southeast Asia for thousands of years. Labor, warfare, transport, ceremony. Never dairy. Elephant milk is extraordinarily rich, around 15% fat, theoretically a fantastic nutritional resource. The problem is entirely practical. A lactating elephant is protecting a calf that weighs around 90 kilograms at birth and gains weight fast, and she is not, even after millennia of human contact, an animal that tolerates being approached for milking the way cattle and goats, bred for docility over thousands of years, will accept. There are scattered historical cases of people consuming elephant milk, almost always from hand-raising orphaned calves, but nothing resembling a systematic elephant dairy tradition ever developed anywhere. And once you picture trying to milk a 3-ton, fiercely protective mother, it's not hard to see why. Hippos produce a reddish-tinted milk, colored by a compound called hipposudoric acid that also functions as the hippo's natural skin moisturizer and sunscreen. No human culture has ever built a dairy tradition around hippos, and honestly, no further explanation is required once you remember what a hippo's temperament is actually like. Bears produce milk running around 25% fat during denning season, extraordinarily rich, built to fuel rapid cub growth through hibernation. Bears are also, it should go without saying, bears. Now, back to lactose intolerance and the actual chronology of how humans started drinking milk in the first place, because it's more interesting and more misunderstood than people assume. For the overwhelming majority of human history, essentially everything before dairy pastoralism began around 10,000 years ago. Milk from any animal simply wasn't part of the adult diet. Every adult on Earth was lactose intolerant. That wasn't a problem, because nobody was drinking enough animal milk to trigger symptoms in the first place. Once dairy pastoralism developed, humans suddenly had access to a rich new calorie source, but most people still couldn't digest it comfortably. The solution ancient dairy cultures landed on almost immediately was fermentation. Cheese, yogurt, kefir, and similar foods contain dramatically less lactose than fresh milk, because the lactic acid bacteria responsible for fermentation consume the lactose themselves as fuel. A fully aged cheese can carry 10 to 100 times less lactose per serving than the milk it was made from. That meant lactose-intolerant people, which was most people, could still access the calories and nutrition of dairy pastoralism, just filtered through a form their gut could actually handle. Archaeological evidence backs this up directly. Ancient pottery bearing dairy fat residue and traces of fermentation bacteria shows up early and consistently at dairy keeping sites. Once the lactase persistence mutation appeared and started spreading, it opened up access to fresh liquid milk too, which carries more calories per volume than fermented dairy because none of the original sugar has been consumed by bacteria. A real caloric edge in the demanding, calorie-scarce world of early pastoral life, and exactly why the mutation spread as fast as it did wherever dairy became a dietary staple. Here's a piece of the story that usually gets skipped entirely: why humans started drinking animal milk at all, instead of simply keeping animals for meat and leaving the milk alone. The answer traces back to plain observation. Ancient herders spent enormous amounts of time around lactating cattle, goats, and sheep, watching calves, kids, and lambs nurse, watching milk flow, seeing directly how physically accessible that supply was. The very first taste of animal milk by a non-nursing human was almost certainly opportunistic, maybe even incidental. Herders handling lactating animals during routine work would have had milk expressed right in front of them, and tasting it wasn't some conceptual leap. It was the same experimental, everything is potentially food approach ancient humans applied to every resource around them. And because they'd already grown up understanding human breast milk as food, extending that framework to animal milk wasn't a cognitive stretch at all. Just an observation that this was the same category of substance, differently composed, but nutritionally comparable. It's also worth knowing this story isn't confined strictly to domesticated animals. Ancient hunter-gatherers who came across lactating wild animals sometimes drank their milk too. Ethnographic accounts of traditional hunting cultures describe drinking the milk of recently killed lactating prey, a form of resource maximization, wringing extra nutrition out of a kill. The colostrum-rich milk of a freshly birthed or freshly calved animal was recognized as especially nutritious and consumed whenever it was accessible. This wasn't dairy pastoralism in any organized sense, just opportunistic use of whatever showed up during normal hunting. But it's likely exactly this kind of encounter that planted the recognition, long before any systematic herding existed, that animal milk was a genuinely valuable resource. And the picture of which milks humans have actually consumed throughout history is far more varied than the modern, cow-centric Western dairy aisle suggests. In Mongolia and across the Central Asian steppe, fermented mare's milk, kumis, has been a dietary staple for thousands of years. Its low-fat, higher lactose composition making it far better suited to fermentation than to cheese, producing a mildly alcoholic, nutritionally significant beverage in an environment where plant food was scarce. Across the Tibetan Plateau and high Himalayan regions, yak butter, cheese, and fermented milk have sustained communities for millennia. Yak butter tea, made by emulsifying strong tea with yak butter and salt, delivers exactly the caloric density that extreme cold and altitude demand. Among East African pastoral communities like the Maasai, cattle milk, blood, and meat together formed the core of traditional diets, and the East African lactase persistence mutation, which arose completely independently from the European one, spread through these populations for the same underlying reason. Fresh milk was central to daily nutrition, and digesting it without symptoms was a genuine advantage. Across North Africa and the Middle East, camel milk has sustained desert pastoralist cultures for thousands of years with a distinct composition, lower fat, different growth factor, and protein profiles that suited desert life and has recently attracted fresh scientific interest for its nutritional properties. In every one of these cases, the animal chosen for dairy wasn't objectively the best milk animal on Earth. It was simply whichever locally available species combined the right domesticability, yield, and composition for that specific environment and history. So here's the full picture. Humans mostly drink cow milk, and not the milk of most other mammals, because of a very specific intersection of domestication history, local ecology, and the sheer accident of which large milk-producing animals happen to have the right combination of traits to be systematically managed by ancient humans. The reason most adults today can drink that milk without getting sick, something that would not have been true for nearly all of human history, comes down to a genetic mutation that appeared just 7,000 to 10,000 years ago in populations where dairy pastoralism had just become a meaningful new food strategy and spread because it delivered a real caloric advantage wherever fresh milk was available. The reason early dairy traditions leaned so heavily on fermented products instead of fresh milk is that most people building those traditions didn't carry that mutation yet, and fermentation was how they accessed dairy's benefits without the digestive consequences. And the reason you can stand in a modern grocery store today weighing cow milk against oat milk as equally legitimate options traces back through 10,000 years of one species deciding which other species were worth living next to, and then almost by accident, evolving the exact mutation needed to make that decision pay off nutritionally until an entire global industry grew up around it. The person reaching for oat milk is making a perfectly reasonable choice. The person reaching for cow milk is standing at the end point of one of the more consequential dietary decisions in the history of our species. Both of them are standing in an aisle that exists purely because of ancient choices about which animals were worth keeping close. The whale, notably, isn't represented anywhere in that aisle. The whale seems completely fine with that.